Today we're going to take a look at the PC version of Valkyria Chronicles 4. This might be the PC game, but most of what we'll take a look at applies to the Switch, Xbox 3, and PS4 versions too. I've been a fan of the series ever since the PS3 days, so I was very excited to see the series return to the way it was before the PSP games. And the fact that there's a Switch version means a whole load of new people are going to be introduced to Valkyria Chronicles, which is always awesome. If you aren't aware of what Valkyria Chronicles is about, here's a bit of a primer. The series is a turn-based strategy RPG with real-time elements. All the games take place in an alternate reality World War II setting, except it's called the Second European War, and the fictional countries and their locations don't clearly match up with real-life counterparts. But the general themes of what happened in World War II still exist, except that there are no airplanes apparently. The bad guys are the Imperials who are fighting against the Federation. Both superpowers are fighting over Ragnite, which is a glowing blue ore that is used as a power source and numerous other things. All of the games focus on a group of soldiers from a small independent nation called Gallia, which is situated right between the Federation and the Imperials. That's really convenient for storytelling purposes. There is a fantasy element, but that's usually revealed much later in the game, so I'm not going to talk about that since that could be considered a spoiler. But then again, it's in the title. Valkyria Chronicles 4 very much follows in the footsteps of the first game of the series, rather than the two later PSP titles, both in gameplay and story. The story focuses on Squad E of the Federation, but the four main characters are actually from a Gallian town called Hafen. Claude is the squad leader, Raz is a hot-headed shock trooper, Riley is a grenadier with a knack for science, or at least blowing stuff up, and Kai is a cool-headed sniper. As the story goes on, characters develop and change. The world feels vast and real, and as I kept playing, I almost felt like I was really part of this adventure. That's something I really like about both this and also the first game of the series. There's something about how the story is constructed and portrayed that really captures my imagination. We'll talk about the story in more detail later on, but for now, let's talk gameplay. If you're familiar with the first Valkyria Chronicles, then you're going to feel right at home here. It's remarkably similar. At first, it feels like it's the same game, but there's a few gameplay functions thrown in to give you something new to experience. On the flip side, if you're one of those players who's only experienced the second or third game on the PSP, you might be surprised to see some gameplay elements and classes missing. I personally think that's a very good thing because a lot of the changes made gameplay easier and there were too many unrealistic elements added. Gameplay is turn-based and you can control units from two different views. The top-down tactical view allows you to see the map's terrain, your units, as well as the enemies in your field of view. When you select a character, one action point is used up, and the game transitions into a real-time environment where you can move around and attack. Enemies can see and shoot you in the third-person mode. Time does stop again when you aim. It's a great blend between real-time and turn-based gameplay. It allows you to take a little time to think about things, but at the same time you still have to act fast when it counts. Every time you select the same unit again within the same turn, you'll notice that the distance they're able to move is less and less each time. This resets back to full after every turn. The objective for each mission is different. A lot of the times you need to take over enemy base camps, but things can be a bit more specific on some occasions, like surviving a certain amount of turns or reaching a specific location. Failure conditions can vary from mission to mission as well. I think the amount of variety in here enhances the immersion because each mission's objective corresponds to whatever is going on in the story. There's a number of different classes of soldiers, all of which you have to utilize in order to win. There are scouts, shock troopers, lancers, snipers, engineers, and grenadiers. Scouts are the most mobile of all. They're great when it comes to scoping out the map and have quite good range with their rifles. They can't shoot that many rounds and don't deal that much damage. But you can take down enemies pretty well if you aim at the head. It's usually best to keep a good distance between scouts and enemies, as they can be taken down rather fast. If you need a bit more firepower, it's the shock troopers you need. Featuring machine guns, they're able to deal much more damage. They also do well when it comes to dealing with intercepting fire. They can't run as far as scouts, but if there is any class that can charge into enemy territory, it's the shock troopers. I guess tanks can too, but they can't take over base camps. Lancers are anti-tank infantry that shoot rockets. Not much to say here other than aim for the tank's weak spot. Snipers are like lancers. They work in a similar way, except you shoot people in the face from far away instead of firing a rocket up a tank's ass. Snipers aren't the most mobile creatures, but that's what the range is for. Engineers are similar to scouts, but can't travel as far and are a bit more susceptible to enemy fire. They are, however, capable of repairing things like sandbags, ladders, and tanks, and they can also disarm mines. Engineers can restock ammunition of anyone they come close to. That's really handy. New to the series is the Grenadier class, which works a little differently from other units in a number of ways. They can launch shells at enemies, and they deal a lot of damage. And they can deal a lot of damage to a group of enemies even if they're close together. One interesting thing about them is that they can attack enemies when it's not your turn, like shock troopers and scouts and engineers. But at the same time, they have limited ammo when it's your turn. It's great how they can shoot over obstacles and terrain, and they can even take out tanks if you aim correctly. There's also tanks, of course. Your main tank is called the Hafen. The great thing about it is that it has anti-tank rounds, mortars, and machine guns to deal with a variety of opponents. Plus, it acts as a sort of movable shield, allowing infantry to get to places that would otherwise be impossible. Speaking of moving troops, it's a bit later on in the game that you get an APC unit which allows you to transport troops through the battlefield with ease. The only problem is that even gunshots damage the vehicle slightly, so you can't really use it in the same way as a tank, but I guess that's kind of the point. And even later still, you get a second tank which is equipped differently to the Hafen. As you can see, there's a decent variety when it comes to units. Compared to Valkyria Chronicles 2 and 3, the classes are much more realistic in this game. That's something I didn't like about the PSP games. There were so many different subclasses that are painfully shown in anime spec. The worst one is the Fencer. You don't bring a sword into a gunfight. In between missions, you can also do other things like level up characters and develop weapons with the XP and money you receive from winning. When leveling up, you level up a class rather than just one specific character. That way you don't have to worry about managing individual characters in that way. Eventually, when your classes are turned up to 11, they become elites and gain new abilities. For example, elite shock troopers have flamethrowers, which are really helpful when dealing with more than one enemy and or crouching enemies. And elite snipers can deal intercepting fire, which makes them less vulnerable than before. Developing equipment is equally important as leveling up, and it even gives you some strategic options to play with. Eventually, weapons split off into different development paths, with each one specializing in its own strength. Like for example, you can have machine guns that are more powerful, or go for ones that do less damage but have more accuracy and range, or even one with a bigger clip size. I'm personally a fan of having extra bullets. Sometimes having a few more shots is more beneficial than a slightly higher damage number. But the good thing is that you can decide what your approach is. Not only that, but you can also give different characters different guns if you want to diversify your squad. Speaking of squad, there's a bunch of unique characters you can deploy. They all have their own good and bad points, as well as people they like to be with. It really sells the idea that each soldier has their own personality. It's fun just scrolling through all the different ones. And if you've played Neptunia games, you'll even notice some familiar voices. You have to be careful though, because these characters can die permanently if they fall and an enemy gets to them before you do. There are side missions involving some of these characters which you can't play if they die. Opposing troops become better as you play, and there are some new units that'll make your life a bit harder. Unlike in the first game, there's now anti-tank cannons that can shoot at your tank while you're moving. I think that's a good thing. A lot of times it's been way too easy to just stroll into an enemy base. Let's talk about the graphics now. VC4 still has the great watercolor painting look going for it. I really like all the creative ways the developers were able to show mood and atmosphere. The environments are nice and varied, and the character models look unique and well done. There is an extraordinary amount of detail in all of the equipment too. For example, all the weapons have different designs when they're upgraded or split off into different development paths. I just think that's really cool. It looks very similar to the first game of the series, but if you play them back to back, the difference is pretty easy to see. Everything just looks a bit better. That being said, there's a lot that looks like it's straight out of the first game. The menus and character animations, for example, look totally identical. It's not like it looks bad or anything, it's quite the opposite, but I can see how some people can feel a bit disappointed with the lack of advancement in that department. I can easily look past that. Plus, I'm just glad the series went back to its original look and gameplay. So in that context, it's more like a it's good to be back sort of feeling. Whatever your view is on that matter, I think most people will agree that this is a good looking game. Cutscenes are a mix of pre-rendered scenes and visual novel style conversations. That's where you notice most of the recycled animations. Since this is the PC version, the game is running at 60 FPS. There's a good amount of options to customize things in terms of the graphics. I cranked everything up except for that scaling thing because putting that at max made it run worse. It looked nicer, but I prefer to take a minor hit in quality in order to do the 60 FPS-ness. I think the sound effects are appropriate. I never experienced war firsthand, so I can't say if any of these sounds are realistic or not. You can choose between English and Japanese voices. I like the English dub, so that's what I left my game on. The music is beautiful, just like it always was in the first game. A lot of video game music can be so overdone in a feeble effort to sound epic. You know what I mean, right? It's like the orchestra is building up and then the drums come in the background and then someone chants something about the Dragonborn, yeah. The Morrowind version of that theme song is the best. Anyways, the music in Valkyria Chronicles 4 is really good at portraying more subtle emotions. Combined with the visuals, the game can be a bit of an introspective experience even. I've been playing with keyboard and mouse controls this entire time. The good thing is that you can customize a lot of the controls, and menus and overlays actually properly show you the correct keys. Thank God. As of this video, there's been 2 patches. One patch fixed the bug where the cutscenes would just freeze, and the second patch added a little toggle thing where you can switch between running and walking. No more running into mines. They did a really good job with the port. I'm impressed. It could have been so much worse. If you want to play with a controller, then that's not a problem either. It works the same way as it does on a console, and it works very well. And now I want to talk about some observations I have about Valkyria Chronicles 4. There might be the occasional spoiler about this as well as past games, so be warned. I'm going to put a time code on the screen if you want to skip this section. Alright, let's get into it. The first thing isn't really a spoiler, but I was thinking how people commented that they didn't like the sudden rise in difficulty after the first part of the first game. The same thing happens in the fourth game too, but I actually think it's appropriate in both cases. The whole point is that you're supposed to think, oh man, I'm really in the thick of it now, just like the characters. And I think it's a good way to at least hint at that sort of feeling. I also noticed that the AI can still be incredibly stupid. I made some pretty bad mistakes in one mission, and I could have lost easily several times if the computer decided to move their units that were just in front of my base camps. This happened multiple times in one turn over multiple turns. Some of the backstory was also better explained in the first game, I think. This isn't a problem if you've played it, but newcomers might be a bit confused about the Darksons and their persecution, or what Valkyries are. I'm also not sure how I feel about how the main characters are introduced. It's like you're suddenly thrown into a conversation with a group of friends you don't know. And the whole Riley has a beef with Claude thing gets resolved rather quickly in the beginning. That's also around the time we find out that Kai's real name is actually Lena. It took almost 10 hours of playtime until there was an interlude chapter where Raz explains to Riley that Kai left the army and put his little sister in his place as a double. In a way that was even lampshaded because Riley mentioned that it's kind of weird how there was no explanation as to why, but she just went along with it because everyone else did. But that's basically all I have to say. I really like Valkyria Chronicles 4 and I'm really glad that the PC port ended up being really good. Despite a few niggles, I'm really enjoying the game and its story. I feel just like I did when playing Valkyria Chronicles 1 for the first time. That's not something I usually get when playing sequels. I'm also going to do a separate video about the DLC that came with the pre-ordered game, just because I think there are people who want info on that without having to sift through an entire review. If I get the other ones, I'll make videos on those too. Hopefully you found the video helpful or interesting. Like the video if you did, and subscribe for more videos. Check out Patreon if you want to help out with the channel. I've noticed there have been a couple of new supporters last month, so thank you very much for supporting the channel. And everything else like Twitch, Twitter, and Discord info is on the screen before you and also in the description. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you again in the next video.